Good evening, everyone. I think we're going to get underway now. We have our panel completely here. Thank you for coming along to this discussion. Obviously, we want to start with the situation concerning Alan Johnston of the BBC. We all know it's the 6th week that he's been held. We want to then, though, branch out to talk about the situation for local fixers and translators, local journalists who are working for Western news organizations, and what responsibilities there are toward their welfare. And obviously we have in mind tonight as we meet the situation that came about in Afghanistan, and we're going to talk more about that. But first, I'd like to turn to John from the BBC, John Williams, the foreign editor of the BBC, to tell us what we know, what's the latest information we have about Alan.
John, thank you. I think the truth is that today is the 44th day of Alan's incarceration. And we know little more on day 44 than we knew on day 1. There are many rumours, and today the Palestinian general delegate, the de facto ambassador in London, has told people that Alan is alive and well. How well he can be, frankly, after spending 44 days imprisoned, I don't know. But while we welcome the assurance, and it echoes comments by President Abbas in Stockholm and Athens at the weekend, we have no proof of how Alan is. And the facts, to be absolutely honest, are very few and far between. The fact is that Alan was abducted at gunpoint on the 12th of March, and beyond that, we know nothing. We don't know for a fact who holds him. We don't know for a fact what will get him back. We hope and pray that he is alive and that he is okay. But after 44 days, we are very worried. And we continue to press the Palestinian Authority to do all that they can to ensure that he is returned to us and to his family safe and well.
Is there anything at this stage any other news organizations can do beyond just simply the solidarity of hoping the best for you all? Is there anything anyone can do beyond the kind of political pressures you're trying to exert?
Part of my job, to be absolutely honest, is about managing expectations. And I think that what we have said to colleagues, and there are a number of them in the room, is that it isn't helpful to indulge in speculation about what may or may not be going on in terms of any discussions that may or may not be taking place between the Palestinian Authority and the people who hold Alan. And I think the safest thing that we can do as an organisation, and the thing that we ask everybody else to do, is simply stick to the facts rather than indulge in what may or may not be happening. Because at the point at which stuff enters the public domain that is unhelpful, then that can seriously impact on Alan's welfare. And bluntly, it can also complicate the discussions that are going on between ourselves and the Foreign Office and ourselves and the Palestinian Authority. And inevitably in this situation, there are discussions that take place that need to take place in private. And beyond that, it is important that Alan is a symbol of what is a much broader problem that we're going to come on to. 167 journalists have been killed around the world this year. I was with Rodney at the House of Commons earlier today. And press freedom and the ability to report without fear of intimidation and danger has never been more great. In the BBC, we've already seen our local staff in Afghanistan intimidated. and facing death threats. The same in Afghanistan. So Baghdad, Kabul, and Pakistan. Alan is a symptom of a much broader problem. And I think it's important that our audiences, whether they are to television, to radio, or to newspapers, or online, reflect on the risks that journalists take in order to tell important stories. And they do so because they believe the stories need to be told.
Thank you, John. John was referring to Rodney, being Rodney Pinder, who is the executive director of the International News Safety Institute. And earlier today at the House of Commons, actually, there was a special committee hearing really considering this report, Killing the Messenger, which is a 10-year study of the attacks and deaths of journalists around the world. And Rodney will weigh in later. We're also very pleased to have Rob Marney, another press freedom group from the Committee to Protect Journalists. And Rob, in a few moments, will also talk more about the situation for journalists around the world. But one of the reasons we're meeting here tonight, and this is a little different from our normal sessions, we don't want this to be simply rehashing the familiar discussion about what is happening to journalists. That's an assumption. We know that. We all know that. We want to talk a lot tonight about what can be done, not only to get Alan Johnston released, but also to try to press news organizations to meet the responsibility toward the others that are taking risks. So I hope all of you will be joining us in trying to make this a kind of prescriptive evening in which we come up with ideas that might even translate into a declaration coming out of here tonight. So be thinking about positive things we can talk about. But also this evening came about because some of the members of this club who are working in Afghanistan were outraged about the coverage of the eventual release of Daniele Mastrogiacomo from La Repubblica, and how little attention was paid to his Afghan translator and fixer Ajmal Naskhbandi, who was eventually murdered. And they said, make it a matter of issue in London. Talk about it at the Frontline Club. And that's what we're doing here tonight. And one of those who knows a lot about Afghanistan and who's taken those risks for the BBC is Najibullah Razak, who with David Loyne, who is sitting at the back, were responsible for getting to the Taliban and took enormous risk and came back with a remarkable series of stories. Najibullah, tell us about what responsibilities there are toward Afghan local journalists like yourself, what you know about the situation right now since this murder. Essentially, try to fill us in on what is going on. And I want to talk to you about a rather unusual thing that happened when the Afghan journalists decided to withhold their services for a week. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Hello to everyone.
Like me, you'll have to hold your mic up closer. I'm the worst at this, so.
All right. Thank you.
Pretend you're David Loyne.
First, I want to contribute to Ajmal Naskhbandi's family and all journalists who are called at the line of duty. And the situation or the scenario that happened in Afghanistan when Daniele and Ajmal Naskhbandi was involved is quite complicated, and it's quite tragic that I don't know if it's new or it used to be before, that journalists are used as a bargain chips and invited for interviews, then they are keeping them, then they ask for ransom, and then they exchange them for prisoners. It's quite tragic, and it's quite worrying that these groups are using journalists as a bargain chips. The story of Ajmal Naskhbandi and Daniele and their drivers, there are different scenarios to their stories. One of them, which I heard, because I was involved in the release to a limit. Ajmal Naskhbandi was failed first by the Italian government. Second, his release was failed by the Afghan government. When Daniele was when he was in custody of the Taliban, the Italian government was, offering everything possible they can to secure his release. And I was telling them, look, there are two people. Can you please, mention the local guy as well, because he's very important. If he's, if something happened to him, then they'll come back on you. And they were not listening. And then this is true. The guy, when the deal was reached and the Taliban agreed to release Daniele and Ajmal Naskhbandi, and the guy was negotiating, he went to receive the prisoners, the journalists and the fixer. He went there, and the Taliban brought both of them. I don't know what happened there. Daniele will know, the Taliban will know, and the guy who was now with the Afghan intelligence service, he knows what happened there. He went there and came back just with Daniele, and he didn't have Ajmal Naskhbandi. And I heard that Ajmal Naskhbandi was there. Nobody cared about him. Everybody was caring about the Italian guy to come back safely, because the Prodi government needed him so much to secure a vote in the parliament, so you can have the troops in Afghanistan. So Ajmal Naskhbandi was there, and the Taliban said, okay, let's have him back, have him use him for another release. That's what I heard, and it's true, I think, because it was confirmed to me by Taliban. This is what happened, and it was confirmed by me by the sources in Kabul. What happened, how they got kidnapped is quite complicated. I think it was a setup. They didn't know where they were going. It was a dead end. They went there, and instead of meeting Taliban, they were ambushed and they were arrested. And my advice will be, if someone wants to do, entering such a groups, they should be very careful, and they should know at least what they are dealing with, who their fixer are. Is there any exit strategy? If something goes wrong, can they come out alive and safe, or they're going to embarrass everybody, and they're going to put in a big worry their families, their loved ones. So I think if someone wants to do similar sort of stuff, they should think twice.
Well, let's come back to some of the things you said, because it does speak to professional practices and standards that we have to talk about too. Kin Sengupta, you've been in and out of Afghanistan. You've used local fixers and translators. How do you think the Independent would have reacted had, God forbid, the same thing happened to you and someone working with you? And what would your responsibility be that would be different from what you have seen happen?
Well, hopefully we'd have behaved differently and perhaps slightly better. Like all of my colleagues, I was quite startled and depressed by the way I think the two Afghan journalists were abandoned. It's interesting that the guy I work with in Kabul, Ali Marga, had been very skeptical about going on these sort of embeds with the Taliban. David did a brilliant job there. And after that, there was a whole flurry of journalists who wanted to do that. And in Lashkar, we met people who were basically acting as agents who would get us in with the Taliban. Alim's view was that it's only a matter of time before one of the journalists is taken hostage, and that's what happened. I mean, we do have a tremendous duty of care. Journalist I worked with in Iraq, in Basra, Nur al-Kal, was abducted along with Stephen Vincent, an American journalist, and Stephen Vincent was murdered. Nur was shot 4 times and left for dead. Now, I'm ashamed to say I don't even know where Nur is at the moment. We tried to get her out. She was in Baghdad briefly, being looked after by the Americans because she was a material witness to the killing of Vincent, who was an American citizen. But of course, when that investigation got nowhere, as was going to be the case, the Americans basically just dumped her outside the green zone and said, go on back home to Basra. And Nur pointed out that if she went home to Basra, she'd be killed. The Americans washed their hands off her. The British were more helpful. We did try very hard to get her out, and at one stage she was going to come to man. and then we sort of lost track. So I simply don't know, where she is or what's happened to her, sadly. Haider is here. He's the journalist we worked for a long time in Baghdad with, and frankly, I couldn't have survived in Baghdad without Haider. And I think one thing that I think we all realize is that we go into places like Iraq and Helmand for a few weeks, and then we come out and tell war stories, and it's the local staff who have to stay there, and they're the ones really who are taking the risk on our behalf.
One of the things that came out of the Afghan situation was, I alluded to earlier, was a week of withdrawal of reporting on the Taliban, which they would not quote the Taliban for a week. We did a Frontline event in New York last week, and Elizabeth Rubin, who writes for Atlantic Monthly, said, why didn't international news organizations consider doing the same thing in solidarity with their local fixers to try to dramatize the situation? Is that a good idea?
It's an idea that's certainly worth discussing. I think there are obvious pitfalls. I mean, the Taliban are not as you know, amorphous organization, and one faction carried out these murders, but the other factions may not have played any part in it. So I don't know. I mean, you are really asking journalists to carry out a form of censorship.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's entirely wrong, but I think that's something that needs to be discussed at great length before we go down that path.
I think one of the things that has impressed us about Alan's situation has been the response of the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate. And they too decided to withdraw reporting of the Palestinian Authority for a period of time because they believed that the PA were not doing sufficiently enough to get Alan out. And, truthfully, all of these organizations, whether it's the Taliban or whether it is a formal authority like the Palestinian Authority, they rely on the oxygen of publicity, to coin a phrase, and actually it is a useful tool, because when Najibullah went with David, we were very clear that they're not doing this for their own good. They believe they've got a message they want to get out there. And at the point at which journalists decide to interrupt the message, then that hits them where it hurts. And whether it is in Afghanistan or whether it is in Gaza, then all of a sudden when people aren't seeing themselves quoted on the wires, then it does strike home.
Now, Najibullah, do you think that is an empty gesture that ought to be avoided, or do you think it's something that should have been considered?
I think that won't help because there are some good Talibans. They want to have good relation with media, and it's quite important that to have them. The murder of in the kidnapping, this Ajmal Naskhbandi in Daniela was carried out by a very extremist group of Taliban. I mean, I know what happened there. These people, Taliban, were willing to release these people without any demands, and they were again kind of kidnapped from the good Taliban by this extremist group, because at the beginning the Italian government was not interested to take responsibility for Daniela or Ajmal Naskhbandi. And I was the first one to call them and tell them, look, this is a journalist, he's not a spy, don't hurt him. And he's saying, no, they confess they're spies, what you're talking about. And I say, no, he is a journalist, wait for the embassy to contact you, and they will confirm. And then, all these, the Italian government, the embassy got involved afterward. And then when they got involved, this extremist group of Taliban kidnapped them from the good Taliban, who were willing to release them without any demands. So I think, boycotting, these groups, it's not a good idea. Now they're a reality, and they're involved, and they're actually fighting British troops in Afghanistan. So if, blocking them from the media will kind of, we won't be able to know the other side of the story.
Rob Marney, the Deputy Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. you see these situations all over the world, you track them. What occurs to you listening to what you've heard, what you already know about, independent of what Najibullah was saying and John has said? What issues occur to you? What questions do you have?
What we do is track, as you say, kidnappings and killings, and the horrific statistic which jumps out is that 85% of the journalists who are killed in the world are local journalists, and of that, half of those are usually working for Western or Japanese organizations. So there is a tremendous duty of care on the part of Western journalists to give to their local staff the same conditions and training and equipment as they give to their home country staff. Because if you look in Iraq, the Iraqi journalists have borne the brunt since about 2004 of all the attacks that have been on journalists in that war. Afghanistan and Pakistan the same. So unfortunately, these incidents are more than familiar to us. In the case of Ajmal, we, from the very beginning, were very insistent that he should not be forgotten. And we organized an open letter of which many of the organizations here tonight signed it. We went and gave as much publicity as we could to the fact that there was another journalist there. Because the mainstream media were running with the Italian. We had photographs of the Italian. We all wanted him to be released and come home safely. But as happened, the local journalist was largely, if not forgotten, played down.
Before we bring in the audience, because many of you have experience in parts of the world that have been involved with incidents like this, and I see Sean Langan, who knows a lot about the Taliban in Afghanistan, has just walked in. Be good to hear from him too. And David Loyne, who's been in and out of Afghanistan. Listening to Najibullah, he makes the point about practices as well, about what journalists do to put them in a position where they might be taken hostage, and the kind of intelligent risk-taking that they apply. What do you try to instill in your colleagues, and what you do to try to not be in that position that might put you in a position of being taken hostage?
In terms of Afghanistan, David and I sat down and had some quite long and difficult conversations before he and Najibullah went to Afghanistan, and we put in place a contingency plan for the worst eventuality if that was needed. In the end, it wasn't needed. But we were very clear that as an organization, we had a responsibility to two people. If they were both taking the same risk, which they were. And actually, it's something that Rodney talked about when we were at the House of Commons this afternoon. That brutally, in a commercial environment, which most organizations are, this is also about reputation. And the BBC and any other organization cannot afford to get a reputation for playing fast and loose. And that ought to be an imperative and a driver towards best practice. And Rodney used the phrase about sort of being selfish. And even if, frankly, we didn't care about anything else but our own reputation, we do have a responsibility to make sure that demonstrably we can take every precaution to make sure that we protect the people who work for us, whether they are home-based staff, as Rob quite eloquently puts it, or locals. To us, it is important that anybody who works for the organisation is entitled to the same degree of care and protection.
Well, in terms of Baghdad, there are some very basic rules in reporting Baghdad. You don't make an appointment to go and see someone because someone might overhear and make plans for you. We use 2 cars. We use 2 battered taxis. Before leaving the Hamra, one of the guys goes out and sees anyone's waiting outside. We have a thing called the Hamra safety net. We speak to each other. So if a journalist goes out, he tells the other journalists, or she tells the other journalists where he's going, what time they're expected back. So there's no hope of any desire for scoops there, because you basically look after each other. But Baghdad is a peculiar place, as you know. And again, you listen all the time to people like Haidar. They are out on the ground, and they come and tell you, which areas are safe, which are not. And I think basically the thing I've found, and my colleagues have found, is to listen to your local staff all the time. And it's also, I think, worth getting on this particular point, experienced local staff who will not take unnecessary risk on their behalf or yours. Now, Ali Marga, who I mentioned in Kabul, is a vastly experienced journalist, and he didn't have to prove himself. He didn't have to earn extra money by taking me to embed with the Taliban, and his view was that it was dangerous and we should not do it. It may have been the case if it wasn't Ali, if it was someone else inexperienced, or someone trying to prove himself, or someone trying to just make extra money. He would have taken that risk, and it could have ended badly for us. So I think it just boils down to one thing, listening to your colleagues, both Western colleagues and the local colleagues, and whatever knowledge one gains from experience in covering conflict areas.
Can I give you an indication of the scale of what we're talking about here in terms of an organisation like the BBC? There are 25,000 people work for the BBC. 10% of them are based overseas. Not just working for BBC News, but for organisations like BBC Worldwide or Factual and Learning. That's 2,500 people. They don't all work in dangerous places. But when you have 10% of your workforce based overseas, you'd be an idiot not to listen to them, because they are an enormous body of people. And that places on us a real requirement to listen and think and train. And one of the biggest challenges for us is how we communicate with them and how we train such a large number of people. And as I say, they don't all work for BBC News, but we owe them, as a group, the same duty of care as we afford the other sort of 22,500 people who work for us in the UK.
Well, let's broaden this out. David Loyne may want to say something. Maybe Sean Langan, who's been in and out. Others of you, please try to improve on our performance up here. Keep that microphone close to you and identify what organization you're with.
Yeah, no, I wanted to talk about this business of boycotting organisations who are holding people. Just before I do, I think there may be a problem in translation. When you talk about the good Taliban, Najibullah, you must mean the real Taliban or the core Taliban. I think there's you wouldn't necessarily say the good Taliban. I think that there may be a valuable gesture in Gaza or in Kabul for a brief period for international journalists to make a point. But I think there's a real problem in using boycotting organisations as any kind of longer-term tool. One of the responsibilities of journalists is to find out what people really think and to find out what's going on behind the scenes. And if we could get to Osama bin Laden, we would. And it's really important to find out actually, what he's thinking now that Mullah Dadullah, the military commander of the Taliban, has been on Al Jazeera today saying he knows that Osama bin Laden is alive. It's the first real indication from someone in vision for several months saying that. I think it's important not only for the general curiosity of journalists, but actually for the bigger picture in the 9/11 world. There's a big danger now that in Iraq in particular, suicide bombers don't need us, inverted commas. They don't need the international media because they are talking deliberately to their own people through the internet. They're filming their suicide bombings and putting them on the internet and recruiting people in that way, in a closed loop. And it means that we can't actually get to those people. And the BBC broadcast things, but if they're not part of the same discourse, then we are in a much more dangerous world. And it is much more dangerous on the road than it ever has been. And it could get even more dangerous. We're saying, well, we won't talk to those people.
Sean, do you want to add something about working with local journalists and your responsibility as a documentary maker?
Yeah, well, because Ajmal was a friend of mine and Syed Agha, both I worked with them on my last two documentaries, and I would like to say actually, on a more sort of practical level, perhaps, because I worked at the BBC and the backup was amazing, much better. Has to be said, than Channel 4. I mean, there are no Channel 4 bureaus. I mean, that's just a simple thing of having a bureau. But the backup at Channel 4 is good. But it's a trickle-down effect. I'm afraid when it gets to the continental press, they're a disgrace. And I dealt with the Ajmal case, and my friend Samuela, who is I have 3 fixers basically in Afghanistan. 2 are now dead. And Sammy went down to Kandahar, was negotiating. The Italian embassy made all sorts of promises whilst he was trying to help get the Italian journalist out. And perhaps, rather than boycott, I'll talk about personal experiences, but if there's anything that could be done, perhaps, is rather than boycott the Taliban, good or bad Taliban, I think that perhaps that pressure could be put on certain magazines, newspapers, television, because frankly, it's a lot worse when you get out of Britain, and the Americans are very good, and the British, and I'm saying good up to a point. I mean, but I know the BBC in the past has got people out in Afghanistan, got them visas. John Simpson had, I think it was a famous case where they got a visa for a fixer, local journalist. That's not my phone. And I think or organisations should perhaps put pressure and at least make it be known to the Italian media. In this case, it's the Italian media, because Repubblica, I don't know what they did, but very little. And it was funny, I was talking to the kidnappers, they called me because they had Ajmal's phone and they were calling his numbers. And I went to the Italian embassy when I was in Afghanistan with another case. Gabrielle, the photographer, was kidnapped. And I said, look, I'm not some weirdo, I'm a journalist, I'd rather not get involved, but hear people how to do it. And the Italian media were just more interested in the story and getting a photo. So I'm a little bit personally upset on this case, but I think perhaps NUJ or Journalists Without Frontier, other organisations, perhaps it could be made known and just sort of disseminated that, there is a responsibility, which I think the Italian press on a number of occasions, I know of examples, have failed on. And especially this journalist, I heard some quite specific things that I don't know what he tried to do. But so when it's me, but I was with Ajmal and Syed Agha was who's described as the driver who was killed. He's actually a local fixer in Helmand. He's very new to the job. I realised I was far more experienced, bizarrely, than he was. He's a local Afghan in Lashkar, but he was clueless and he was very excited because he was making easy money. So you realise you're actually more aware, and they're not aware of how dangerous it is, perhaps. And so there are a number of things, but I certainly would not have left my 2 guys, there. I don't really want to talk about it, but anyway, I just think a very practical thing would be to deal with this question of to try and get other newspapers and media organisations, especially in Europe, to start dealing with it more responsibly.
Rob Marney, you named the 10 enemies of the press. RSF names the predators. against the press, without taking Sean's point, but we don't want to indict Republica without an opportunity to exactly talk about what they did. If there's anyone here from that newspaper, please speak up. But hypothetically now, should we name and shame news organizations that don't treat their people the way that the best news organizations should and meet the standards of practice? Should we be doing more about the industry itself?
I don't think that we should be naming and shaming. I think what we should be doing is what we do as journalists all the time, which is reporting the facts. And if we can get to the facts behind this case and publicize them, then that will serve, I think, the purpose that we want it to serve, which is to get these newspapers or other organizations to improve the conditions under which they send journalists abroad. We definitely put the spotlight rather on people who are not looking after their staff in a way which we would deem to be appropriate, just by reporting on that. I don't think that I would want to name La Repubblica over any other newspaper at this, because actually the facts are quite murky, and those that are in the public domain.
Let's bring Rodney Pinder into this. Rodney represents the International News Safety Institute. Rodney, do you have a view on this issue?
Well, I think if we were naming and shaming, I'm not sure that even if the electronic forest would have enough paper to put the names on to shame, because it is a problem that throughout our industry and in so many dangerous places, local journalists are not being provided the same protection and wherewithal as are staff and international journalists. And this is a major problem, not just because of the obvious point that there seems to be a double standard. There seem to be two levels of journalists out there, locals, which aren't worth the effort, and international, which are. But it affects the safety of the whole news gathering team. We've had incidents where international journalists, properly equipped and trained, are ready to go out in a news gathering team with local journalists who are not properly equipped or trained. And therefore, the ones who have the proper equipment, through conscience, are not wearing it because of the exposure of the local staff. I think the point that the BBC takes care of 2,500 people working overseas is a very good one to make. But the BBC, Reuters, ABTN, CNN, you can count on your hands and toes the number of news organizations that do treat seriously local staff on the same equal footing as international staff, provide them with the same safety training, provide them with the same equipment, provide them with the same insurance. All of these points, there is an apartheid system at work in international journalism. And what's deeply worrying is that the more international journalists and others are being targeted, the more the tendency is in dangerous situations for some so-called international news organizations to not send international journalists into the story, rely on local journalists, but not give them the same wherewithal to look after themselves. They don't have the same duty of care, or they don't think they have the same duty of care. Now, what's going to change this? It's going to take a real effort to change this, but one thing that might change it, we've already had a situation in which one international news company was sued successfully by the family of a journalist who was sent in to cover a story in Latin America without the proper training, and he was killed. And the family sued, and there was a large settlement out of court.
This was in the United States?
Yes, in the United States, and it was an American news organization. This has happened once, and it sure will happen again. So this has got to be considered.
Before I bring you guys in, let's hear from a couple local journalists. Kim, you mentioned Hyder and your colleagues there. From your perspective, looking at how you're treated from international organizations, talk a bit about what you see, what you've experienced. Obviously, you're not going to be too hard on Kim Sen-Gupta right now, but at the bar
at the
later,
moment.
you can tell the real story.
Later. The main issue about like being a local and dealing with international journalists and correspondents and foreign correspondents is that like you must depend on your locals, as Kim mentioned, as your cultural adapter, and also you can depend on him on the security issues. Some of the journalists, like I noticed, that pressurizing their locals in order to get the story. So sometimes it's the problem. Like if you get a guy who's not well experienced and you pressurize him to get the story, I noticed that many of especially freelancers, like who turned over to Baghdad, like in order to find a good story. So they pressurized and then they ended like either kidnapped or like terrible end, unfortunately. Also, like there is not enough equipment when many of the foreign correspondents like came to Baghdad. They will come with only one flak jackets. They don't come like with a 3 or 4. Like if they want like to hire a local, because they thought that this is their own security. Also, like when something terrible happened to the locals, they don't even, after like what happened to Alan Ghazi, Jill Carroll even didn't mention his name, and his driver, who was a friend of mine, he's ended in Jordan. He cannot go to Baghdad. Like nobody backed those two guys. Even sometimes, like the organization avoid to take responsibility about their locals by refusing even to give them IDs. So they give them once. I remember, like a driver came to me with a paper written by hand. He said to me, "This correspondent gave me this paper as my contract with them." So,
You guys want to identify yourselves? Another Afghan here.
Yeah, if I don't identify myself, I may speak freer. Anyway, my name is Shoaib Sharifi. I'm an Afghan journalist working for the BBC World Service, radio for Afghanistan stream. Actually, I want to start with my experience. I came about 2 weeks ago from Afghanistan, almost a week before the killing of Ajmal, so maybe 3 weeks, so it was end of March. I had gone to do sort of a family visit, and also I need to hire a car to go to northern Afghanistan. And in the past, journalists were seen the safest people to work with in Afghanistan, and always among the Afghan journalists, we used to say, among all journalists, that in Afghanistan, even the image of journalists with the Taleban, the extremists or the terrorists or whatever you call them, they have sort of distinguished. There is a fine line between the journalists and the aid workers or the civil servants. So we were not sort of seen as soft targets. But this time, after this driver was killed, I found it very difficult to hire a car when the driver found out that I was a journalist, even for family purposes, to go to northern Afghanistan. Because they said when journalists are kidnapped or arrested, they first kill the driver as the sign of. So this is something a complete change in Afghanistan. This sort of a fear that has been, the image of journalists is seen as prone or risky people to work with. And then the treatment, when often I'm working, I've worked independently and also with some of our foreign colleagues or foreign correspondents. The first thing I have told them that, God forbid, if anything worse happens to us, please don't mention my name as a fixer. We are both journalists going to file a story. And sometimes even I'm mentioning the Frontline Club, that I hope that my name does not appear as a fixer in the Frontline Club if we are killed. Then I would come to authorities, particularly in terms of Ajmal Naskhbandi, that once the authorities were very careful when the Italian journalists were when he was not released. They were saying that we are trying our best, from the prison office to all authorities. They were giving all their speeches very careful. Once the guy was released and the Afghan foreign minister came from Iran, in fact, he was supposed to just brief the journalists to see what he did in Iran, but he straight away started that. I want to clearly mention that we're not interested of making any deals with the Taliban about the abductions or exchange of any, which most of the people believe in that therefore he was killed before the deadline. And then I would come back to us as reporting the abductions. We have to be very careful. So we, the media, reported what the foreign minister said. So sometimes we are the messengers of the messages between the two sides. Sometimes it's good, and sometimes we have to be very careful how we're reporting abductions. And that's it.
Abdul Rahman, you want to say something?
Abdul Rahman, a student at City University doing my doctoral there. Firstly, I want to say that I hope that the American and the British stop liberating countries. Then the journalists will be safe in these countries. And secondly, I want to mention a very important point here. I mean, you are all speak about those who are targeting the journalists as criminal people. And from my understanding, I understand from the whole speech that there is illegal criminals and illegal criminals. So I want to say that we have to name and shame all of the criminals. Like the situation in Iraq, back to Iraq. I mean, I did a documentary film for Channel 4 there with Deborah Davis and Charlie Hose about the criminals, those who are attacking the journalists and the innocent people in Iraq. And the first guy who was asking for my name and following me was the Iraqi Prime Minister. But in all the British media and the American media represent this guy as the protector and the representative of the democracy and the human rights and freedom of speech. So I hope that one day we will see the British media and the American media and all the journalists name and shame all the criminals without caring for anyone. Thank you very much.
Let's come back up here to get some reactions to what they've heard. Then there's several. Your hand was up, Paul, yours is up, so we'll come right back. Just some reactions to what you've heard from the fixers.
I think the last point is really important, and there are two different levels of responsibility. Clearly, media organizations have a responsibility to manage risk, and we should be held accountable for what we do or what we fail to do to manage risk. But I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that actually, if someone is abducted or if someone is killed, the culpability actually is on the people who do the abduction and the killing. And while media organizations have a responsibility to make sure that they try and protect everyone who works for them, whether they are in-country staff or local staff, actually the bad guys are the people who do the killing and the abduction. And I do fear that we need to make sure that we don't lose sight of that. And we have a responsibility also to hold the authorities responsible for the safety of journalists. And bluntly, one of the issues that we have been trying to ensure in Alan's case is that the Palestinian authorities take responsibility for ensuring the protection of all journalists who operate in Gaza, not simply Alan, but also Palestinian journalists, that they can go about their job without fear of kidnap and intimidation.
Najibullah.
As my colleague Shaib said there are some, I'm not talking about the British journalists, they treat their local stuff very well, BBC, ITA and Channel 4. But there are some other organizations, they really play cheap, and even sometimes they don't feed them, and they pay them really little money, compared to what they earn. So it's quite disgraceful. I don't want to be harsh on this Daniele, But one thing really made me very upset when he was rushed out of the kidnapping situation. He was brought to the hospital, then he was brought to Kabul to embassy. Then from there was chauffeur to the airport, and then to Rome. Then he even didn't go to see the family of Ajmal Naskhbandi, which was, they were asking, can we see this guy, because our son was with him. He was the last person that he saw him safe and alive. Can we see him to find out what's going on? They were denied the meeting, and this Daniele, he was just thinking about his next step, that he's going to write a book about it, and he's going to be waving his hands in the up and there and showing himself as a hero. But I mean, I thought about his friend, who was contributing 50% to the story. And I think the local staff should be taken seriously, because they are part of the story. And if they are not there, then the Western media or the international staff will not be able to even go from A to B in those countries. They are hostile environment, they are dangerous places, and they should be insured. They should be at least given a kind of training to 1 or 2 days that the medias are prayed, so they know the standards of the Western media.
I don't want to talk about the detail, because I don't know the detail. All I can say is that clearly, we have thought a lot over the last 6 weeks about what we will do when Alan is free. And anybody who has been held for a period of time is not going to be in a great state. And truthfully, I think had he gone and met the family, I'm not sure he would have made any sense. And I don't think we should think badly of him for a perfectly natural instinct, which is to flee the place that he has been held in order to get home to his friends, his family, the people who love him. And it may seem very hard, but I don't think we should, there may be criticisms that we have of La Repubblica, there may be criticisms that we have of how he has behaved, and as I say, I don't know the detail. I don't think we should criticise him for a natural instinct, which is just to get home as quickly as possible and to put behind him the traumatic situation that he might have been in.
We have heard the complaints from local staff, and I think they're pretty well known to us. Lack of duty of care in some places, the basics of not even giving them body armor, forgetting about them, if you like, once you leave the country, not keeping in touch with them, and then finding out what's happened to them in between your trips. And all that is true, and I suppose all one can do is say, we must strive to do better. This question about La Repubblica, I think there's a slight danger there of a broad brush. I mean, I worked with journalists from La Repubblica in Iraq, in Darfur, where they've treated their staff with all due care and with all camaraderie. So perhaps, one shouldn't be too sweeping in condemning a newspaper for the action of one individual. Just going on to something that I think David raised before he left, this question of whether or not we should boycott the Taliban, ostracize the Taliban. It is interesting because I remember sitting in Kabul with David Richards and some of his senior staff when the great debate was, should people like David have gone with the Taliban, and Lara Logan, I think, before David or after David. And they were divided. And General Richards, to his credit, said, no, this is a fundamental right of the media. And in fact, he pointed out it does help him as well to a certain extent. So I genuinely do think, the more I think about it, that much as we find some of the people we deal with odious, I do think that part of our job is to reflect what they say. And I think to go down this path of carrying out boycotts possibly isn't the best interest of journalism.
Yeah, I think that as the world has become more dangerous for journalists, companies, particularly those that care about their reputation and have big pockets to match, have been providing better safety for their employees. I mean, I doubt whether any of the journalists in this room who were dispatched to a conflict zone in the 1980s would have been given hostile environment training or sophisticated safety equipment. The big companies now do provide such training and equipment to their home-based staff. The question is, how far down the subcontracting chain do the media outlets feel that they have responsibility towards the staff? In other words, if you send a New York-based journalist into Iraq, you provide that person with everything that they would need. If he then hires a driver, is that driver in any way attached to the home organization? Some organizations will say yes, others no. And we had a mention here of freelancers who are taking risks and putting pressure on locally engaged drivers or translators that they may just pay on a daily basis. That's another problem. That's something which needs to be tackled, because I won't use the term against everybody, but there are certain people who operate with a little less caution than they should do in engaging local staff.
I can only talk for the BBC, but it's fair to say that we wrestle with this, and we're quite clear, actually, that anybody who is engaged by the BBC at any level, we then have a responsibility for. And that does impact on what we do, actually, because it means that, at the point at which we give somebody a camera, we are then responsible for their safety. And bluntly, that may be a burden that we don't feel able to accept, which then means that other organisations do give cameras to people and do get pictures and stories that we don't get. But at the point at which we engage in any transaction with somebody in Iraq or Afghanistan, we feel, a moral and, bluntly, it is a legal responsibility to their welfare and their protection, and the consequences that flow from that if the worst happens. And that does act as a brake on ambition and on creativity. And that's a balance that we have to strike every day. And we do lose out sometimes creatively to other organisations who don't. But, I'm quite happy that I sleep at night as a result of that. Because at the point at which we engage someone and don't fulfil our responsibility, then I live with the consequences of that.
Let's go back. Yeah. Hold on just a second, Sean. Let's get a microphone to you.
I didn't want to be the one. I didn't name. I think I started ball rolling on La Repubblica. I wasn't talking about them specifically. I have a few, but I think I meant, instead of boycotting the Taliban, that I think the media organisations in Britain who have a good reputation could perhaps spread the word to continental media. Just the other thing, though, I think we're talking about a lot of different things here. There's foreign reporting in war zones, and then there's what we were doing in Afghanistan, which is going undercover. And to be honest, to put it into context, the slightly difference, we're not. It's there by the grace of God that we weren't kidnapped and killed. Same group, actually, I interviewed, and same local journalists. And at the end of the day, actually, I was aware of the irony when I was sitting down there with a gun to my head. They put me up against a wall. That all the backup, when it comes down to it, is meaningless. And you got your experience. This what can happen after, which comes into action. But when you, as a journalist and as a local journalist, when you're in that situation, if the shit hits the fan, no one can do anything. And yet, I still think it's worth doing if it done. This sounds ridiculous. My mother would laugh when I say the word responsibly. But as much as you can, I do think it's valid journalism. But there's only so much can be done. And I thought long and hard about the risks, and it's my responsibility. And so, it's not a case of Western organisations abusing local journalists or not giving them protection. Both Westerners and locals who do this kind of journalism are pretty much uninsurable and unprotectable.
Can you hand it to a colleague to your left, right there? you've been trying to get into this.
Hi there. My name's Rillian Bridge. I'm kind of a symptom of corporate responsibility of the wealthier news gathering organisations, in as much as I work from time to time as a risk management consultant or hired security goon, depending on your viewpoint, for news gathering organisations. Just a couple of points I'd kind of like to re-emphasise, things that I certainly believe, is that we are very much, whenever we leave a war zone or somewhere where failed state, post-conflict zone, we leave a legacy with the people who look after us. And we can walk away and get on a plane, but they have to live with the consequences of what they've done for us, which is something that Kim said earlier. And also, I've been doing it long enough to realise that my safety and security is very much dependent on my relationships with my local colleagues and friends. But something to add to that, I've also instructed people on hazardous environments courses. And certainly I'd say that the BBC led the way in the world on that, and they are very good. However, I've never instructed anybody on how to look after locals and fixers on hazardous environments courses. And also as an observer of news organisations in war zones, etc., I've never seen a news gathering team deploy with enough equipment to equip their fixers, which I think is something that's very significant. And also when it comes to insurance, pay, etc., there's a massive disparity. And I know it's unfortunate. I know people are very busy and distracted, but I have seen and witnessed locals being treated very badly, and I think it's something that should be taken on board.
So how many news organizations have you worked with as an advisor?
Or 3.
Because
I'm total freelance. I've got no interest in corporate. Yeah.
Because the 2 points made here was put your locals through security training courses, and secondly, make sure they get enough of the same equipment. You're saying
I've never seen it happen. But yeah.
None of those things. Really.
Also, I've been an observer, so I've been around a bit of a groupie around lots of other bureaus in the press pack, so I've seen it from a distance. And I've never, for example, seen locals being trained, and I've never seen operating procedures or emergency procedures translated into Arabic or Dari or Pashto.
Okay, you've hit a chord because the hands are shooting up all over here. Okay, let's take yours, friends, Tina's. Okay, so let's stay on this point, though. If you've got another point, hold it. But let's keep to this one.
I'll just speak very narrowly. I'm speaking from the perspective of NBC News, and I'm a producer based here. And on a rotational basis, I'm the acting bureau chief in Baghdad since 2003. And I can tell you it's been a learning curve for everyone, because no one expected we'd be here today the way we are right now, still dealing with this awful tragedy that's happening there for everyone from foreigners to locals. Part of the learning curve has been to ensure that we have this duty of care that you're talking about. I can't speak for other Western organizations, but I find it a bit sweeping, especially when we were just talking a moment ago. Let's not make sweeping allegations about La Repubblica. It's a bit rich and sweeping to be talking about what XYZ is not doing when they don't know the facts, when the person is not even speaking comprehensively. So I can just speak 1 or 2 facts or details as far as what NBC does. And again, we're still not perfect. We're still learning lots of things. So much of our work, unfortunately, like other Western organizations, is done, I don't want to say by proxy, but it's by entrusting our journalistic coverage to the locals. If they don't want to go and do a story in Sadr City or Adamiyah, Khadamiyah for XYZ reasons, we just don't do it. And if they do it, they have all the same protection that we have. And when we go out also, we've hemorrhaged money on armored cars. They have the option to go out on armored cars. Okay? We also have local Western security teams there giving local hostile environment training there on site because we can't transport people back there. I find it insulting and offensive for someone like this to say nothing's being done. We've had people killed, imprisoned, and tortured. So I'm just speaking on the record about how one news organization is trying to come to grips in this. And quite frankly, because of all the stuff that's been happening out there, that's why NBC is so heavily engaged with even being here with the Frontline Club right now. That's why we're here.
Thank you for that. Paul, you want to get into this.
I mean, I think, or I hope that everybody here believes that local staff should get the same safety, resources, backup, flak jacket that the international staff get. My question is about our response to the reality that in dangerous places or repressive places, it's not only how you get the story, which may affect the safety of your local staff, but how you broadcast the story, how you write it in the end. A little over a year ago, for instance, we were in Lashkar in Helmand, and our local fixer went up and got a taped interview with somebody described as a local Taliban commander. All the discussion in London was quite rightly, were we going to be a propaganda mouthpiece for this man? How much scepticism should we show? And I think we got the story right, but it didn't make him look particularly good. So one of my questions to our local guy was, how is this going to affect you next time you go and speak to this man? Similarly, we had another discussion about whether to ask Ahmed Wali Karzai, brother of the president, whether he was in fact a drug dealer as he'd been described in some international newspaper articles. So, we're sent there to get the truth, to be impartial, to inform our viewers and listeners. But at the same time, should we be thinking about how the tone of a story affects our local staff? Should we be maybe leaving out this fact or that fact? Or is that a slippery slope to somewhere that we don't want to go?
Tina Carr, you had your hand up earlier. Tina with the Rory Peck Trust provides training for freelancers and sadly has the responsibility to look after them if they've been killed in war zones.
And we are actually supporting the other organisations like CPJ who are helping Ajmal's family. No, what I want to say isn't very encouraging. We're currently running the first phase of a good practice program in Mexico. And my colleague has just returned from her second trip, and we are kind of running focus groups, and we're doing a lot of work to find out what's going on there. And the question we're asking is, what's it like? How are the media treating their freelancers out there? And that's really, we're doing it in a fairly simple way. And the answer's coming back loud and clear. Freelancers, what? Basically, they're treating everybody like shit, staff and freelancers. So I'm sorry to be rude, but that's basically what's happening. So what I'm trying to say is, I feel here, in a way, a lot of the organizations that have been named are organizations that are really already aware of the problems and that have really gone a hell of a long way towards trying to do the right thing. And so when you're talking about local journalists, you're also talking about local media. And the other thing is, too, that the training, which somebody said over here, there isn't enough local training, that really rang a bell, because what we're getting back is, training, we would love to have training. Nobody's going to do that for us, but if they do, it's got to be specific to where we are, and not just somebody coming in from outside telling us what they think we need to know.
But that comes back to the point that our colleague from NBC made in the front row, that actually a lot of this training goes on in country. That the large media we ran a training course in Afghanistan a few weeks ago in terms of first aid, sort of the full hostile environment course that we would run in London, we ran for the Bureau in Kabul. The same goes on in Baghdad in terms of it's like being a teacher within in-course training.
Let's take Fran Unsworth then. I think are you with NBC News as well? Okay, then we'll come back to you just after this.
Fran Unsworth, head of news gathering with the BBC. I think we have to differentiate a bit here about what exactly we mean by local staff, because there are sort of different things which we mean here. Local staff, as far as the BBC is concerned, quite often is people who are employed by our foreign bureau, who are in receipt of absolutely every bit of training that our staff people are in London are. Where we have to deal with the realities here is on a big story on the ground, when our correspondents, our producers, end up employing fixers because they need to cover a story on the day. Now, actually, we have to be a bit realistic about this. It's quite difficult to provide those people training if you hire them on the day, and if you hire them for the week or whatever. We all have good intentions here, and anyone that's on contracts with us or is attached to us in any way, we will do everything that we can for. Everything that we can for. They will be in receipt, as I say, of the same training that our London-based staff or our BBC staffers will be involved with. But where things might go awry here is where people hire people on the ground. And that's something that we need to think about. And we need to think about what our responsibilities post anything going wrong are. And I think that's the real issue for us here. I'd just like to support our NBC colleague here, though, about La Repubblica. I think we've actually trashed them a bit here, and they've not been here to defend themselves. We don't know anything about the circumstances of it. And I think it's not really appropriate to start laying into them on that basis.
Another NBC colleague, could you identify your name?
Hi, I'm Maria Maro Pereira with NBC News, but I'm not a journalist. I'm actually in human resources. I get another sign of the amount of money some companies have. I just want to make a different point, which I actually echo what you said, which is I hate this word fixer. Because when I first joined NBC News, I thought fixer to me sounded really dodgy. And then when I started to meet the people, they turned out to be journalists. I think we should stop with that word because it has all sorts of connotations. And there's all sorts of double standards. Once somebody reads, there was so-and-so and the fixer, it's kind of, well, they were in that business, so, tough luck. And I think we should get rid of it and find something else, even for the people who may be, drivers and who do actually fixing. But that's because you were saying maybe we will have some actions. Maybe we can start getting rid of the fixer terminology.
I think that's a very good point. You've been trying to get into this for a while. I'm sorry.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Payton. I'm not a journalist either. I am the sister of Kate Payton, who was murdered in Somalia in February 2005. So I'm not from any of your businesses. As a family, we've been trying to obviously look into what happened to Kate and the circumstances behind that. And I just feel very much for people are referred to as local. And I use the term local to mean people who are native to the particular country. So like you guys sitting behind me, when I say local, that's what I mean. It's been extraordinarily hard for us to get information, to find things out. So I think for any local journalists, fixers, drivers, anybody who can, by connection with a news organisation, arrive in a dangerous situation, it must be phenomenally difficult for them to make choices and for them to get vital information, because it's been hard for us and we're enormously privileged. There was a point made earlier on, I think, by gentleman just sitting at the back there, that maybe it's journalists' responsibility to stand up rather than censoring, journalists self-censoring. It is their responsibility to stand up, name names about news organisations and their relationships with their employees or their freelancers, which of course is a huge divide. If you've actually got a job, or if you're a freelancer or a contractor of any kind, you are treated extraordinarily differently, and that's what I've learned. But we've spoken to a great many journalists in the past 2 and a bit years, and virtually none of them will go on the record because they're scared for their careers, because they're not going to get a job anywhere. If they come out and say, this isn't good enough, that isn't good enough, there's lots of stuff we've discovered, they're scared for their careers. They've got children, they've got families, and that's talking about people who are British, based in the UK. They don't want to go on the record because they want to get another job. Forget risking your life. They want to get another job. So the idea that it's going to be easy for journalists to stand up and do something, don't think journalists, I know most of you are journalists, I'd like to remind you you're human. My experience, I don't know whether you might agree with the Roy Pett Foundation, my experience is that journalists are extraordinarily human. And it's very difficult for them to stand up. So to ask them to do that, I think is very hard, and I hate to be negative, but I just wanted to say that. And the other point I wanted to make is that of risk assessments. Risk assessments were originally established legally, essentially to protect the employer. So that you can tick your list of things we've done all the stuff, we can't be got legally. Now, I think most people use risk assessments. The BBC, Fran, who I know, they do not use them to tick a list. They genuinely care. Again, organisations are made up of individuals that care, but organisations protect themselves. And I'm very interested to know from anybody here who could tell me how a risk assessment can possibly protect a local hire of any kind. It cannot be used. They're outside British law jurisdiction. Now, if the organisation is ABC, the BBC, CNN or whatever, and chooses to behave honourably, will have a shake by the hand, but they only choose to do so. And I'm interested to know if that, we've spoken to a journalist who works in Somalia a lot. He worked for a British news organisation. He said, when I filled in my risk assessment about going to Somalia, where it said, what will you do in the case of emergency? He always wrote, die. This is a guy who doesn't want to go on the record. This is a guy who's been kidnapped and shot, but he will not go on the record because he's too scared for his career. And I feel for local hires, but I wonder about risk assessments, and I wonder about how we might encourage journalists to stand up. Journalists who've got children and mortgages to pay in the UK, why on earth would they stand up for somebody in Sri Lanka? Why would they? How can they?
Let's take those two questions right away. And there were some other points made, but on the risk assessment issue and on associating yourself in a faraway place and the consequences for doing that.
I just want to say I'd quite like to hear from Damien from the Telegraph, who spent a lot of time in Baghdad and Afghanistan at some stage. Just going back, I mean, after your sister was killed in Mogadishu, as you know, foreign journalists didn't go there at all for a long time. I went with an American colleague to Mogadishu just after the Islamists took over, the Islamist cause took over. And the only reason we went there was because Aju Sanura, who was the fixer, I think he had worked with your sister at some stage, told us that it was safe. Now, I mean, there's always a possibility that just by being with us, there's myself and an American journalist, I mean, the one good thing was that both of us were non-white, dark skin, and that helps tremendously from wherever one is in a conflict situation. But we also knew that just despite that, being with Ajus puts him in as much danger as perhaps it put us, especially with some of the Islamist cause faction like Commander Ira, who had said he'll kill anyone who cooperates with the foreigners. But talking about risk assessment, the whole thing is so difficult. On the way out of Mogadishu in Nairobi, we met a group of journalists who were deciding whether or not to go in. And I said that, well, look, this isn't Baghdad. We had a week there. We're all right. Nothing happened to us. And that was it. And one of the journalists who went in, who we all know, a very, very good Channel 4 cameraman, went in and was shot dead subsequently the following week. Now, I'm not entirely sure how risk assessment comes into this almost. It's almost a matter of luck, if you like. But you're also right in the sense that, there's no way that I would have stood up for Ajus in front of the Islamist cause militia in Mogadishu. I simply have been, too frightened.
Just on the issue of risk assessment, all we can do is try and manage risk. We can never eliminate it. And the purpose of a risk assessment has to be to get people to focus on the unimaginable. And what would we do if? And the very process of doing the risk assessment delivers the dividend, hopefully, which is of making people think about a contingency and think about the danger that they face. And it can never be, it isn't and can never be, a get out of jail free card. But just the process of doing it hopefully equips us with a contingency plan so that when the worst happens, we've begun to think about some of the issues that we'll confront. And it will never be easy. But the whole purpose behind doing them is to get us to think about the unimaginable.
Najibullah, the value of these courses for a local journalist, and also, again, the difficulty of standing up and supporting a local journalist in a difficult time, the risk that...
First, I will talk about the hostile environment course I did it 2 eyes. And I think they'd be very useful for Westerners, but for me it was useless. It was a waste of time and money. And it made me laugh. But I mean, the first aid course was quite important, and I learned a lot of stuff. I mean, they should design a different kind of course for the locals by the local, not by Westerners who probably know not enough about the local customs and stuff.
Can I just address that? I think that's a very fair point, and that's precisely what we've done in Afghanistan with the local staff. Because the point that you make is absolutely true. the idea of where's the bullet coming from, if you've heard lots of, it is pointless. And the point is absolutely right. And that's why our colleague here says that, the point is in Baghdad or in Kabul, what the security guys do who work for us is to train the local staff on an ongoing basis.
Okay, now back to Najibullah here. Yeah. Continue.
Okay. The risk assessment is quite important. And to have all these backups is also, it's important. But as Sean said earlier, what if, they put you against the wall and they're going to kill you? Are they going to arrive in flick of an eye? No, they're not. So always have an exit strategy. Don't go somewhere you're not sure. Have the security and the guarantee that they will not kill you, they will not kidnap you. So have this before you're going in there. And also the important thing is to the people who are working on the ground, the drivers. Fixers or producers that they're working on the ground with you, you should know them for long enough so you can trust them that they're not connected to local intelligence service. The people who are fighting with the rebel groups, they're not working for American CIA or other intelligence services, because they might have some you won't know because you're there fresh out there. And you hiring these people, they will be, they have tills. They will have tills on them. They will have they will have personal feuds with some, with a group that you're trying to meet. And because of those, you will be, kidnapped or killed or armed in the process. But have a risk assessment, and also do not go somewhere that you don't think you see 1% of chance being kidnapped or killed. So don't go there. It's not worth it. You're not there to make a name, and at the end you'll be killed. So my advice is, have a very thorough risk assessment and see if the new, if the story has a value to it. You want to really report, or you want to make your name. So it's quite important. Yeah.
Tina, the reporter from the Daily Telegraph. Hyder, you want to get into this? Okay. Could you identify? I'm sorry, Mr.
Yeah, I'm Damien McElroy. I work for the Telegraph. I'd like to go back to what I found offensive use of the word apartheid earlier, and it was very least obnoxious if it wasn't offensive. But apartheid, because you're in a slight, even if you take that at several levels. At one level, you're in a position of creating an oligarchy of news in which only those organizations with the resources to fully do everything that people have been talking about here are in conflict zones. And I think you have to be more shaded than that, because other organizations have to get in. Yes, some may be cowboys, some may have freelancers who take chances, and they may be good freelancers who do quite well. They may not. These conflict situations are always evolving. They're always going through stages, and you can't be prescriptive. Now, you have to, as an organization, do your best, but you can't get into the situation where organizations feel as if they can't go into a situation because it's going to cost them too much, and they're going to, tie down too many resources to cover a particular situation.
Hyder.
Thanks, John. Back to the BBC and NBC. You mentioned that you are doing the same stuff for the foreign correspondent as for the locals. Are they insured? Are you sure that all of your colleagues from the local staff insured as you guys? And I know many very well reputed organizations who do not insure their local staff.
Anybody who works for the BBC is covered by, in the event that something tragic happens to them, then we insure them in exactly the same way. Now,
do you insure them before or after the contract?
Well, at the point at which they sign the piece of paper, And actually, it doesn't matter whether it's an...
Is that why the people are avoiding signing papers?
Well, I hope that nobody who works for the BBC, and actually it doesn't matter whether the contract is for one day.
I don't mean the BBC, I meant in general. But like for the BBC, like all the people are insured, and or only for the terrible situation they'll be insured?
No, anybody who works for us, at the point at which they engage their services for the BBC, we then take a responsibility for them. And it doesn't matter whether it's for one day, for 1 month, or for 1 year. At the point at which we engage them, then we bear a responsibility for them. And that's why I say earlier on that actually, that responsibility extends, frankly, to giving them a camera. At the point at which we ask somebody to do something for us, we have a responsibility to them.
Tina, quick one right there on this.
It's a very quick one, and this is not addressed to anyone in particular. I just want to point out that since Martin Adler was killed in Mogadishu, and he worked for very many people, he did work for some more than others, everybody knows that, but since that time, his family have received not one single penny from anybody he worked for in the UK. They have received support from Sweden, from Swedish organizations. They have received nothing. We have given them a little bit of support, very little. We strongly ask the broadcasters to think what happens when they use freelancers regularly, and what happens if they are not actually commissioned at the time of their death. Do they still consider they have a responsibility when they have been regular users?
We didn't get the name of the NBC bureau chief. Perhaps you wanted to say this. Can we hear from the bureau chief as opposed to the human resources person? No, but I'd like to hear from the NBC bureau chief here.
Well, actually, the beauty of it all is that we work in tandem. So what I can't finish, she finishes. My name is Carl Bostic, but I can say that as for everyone, no one had a plan for this when all this bad stuff happened 3, 4, 5 years ago. And everyone has had a very, very steep learning curve. And for the person who says, well, we're all human, the answer is yes, of course. And we're not going to ignore bad things to happen to people, whether they're from where we are or from there locally. And we've had to try to, conform what our rules are. Because, okay, NBC happens to be a company that works for GE. And we try to apply practices across the board. We've had specific cases where we've had to deal with people being injured in the field, and these are things we wrestle with. So the short answer is, in the beginning there was no plan, but as a result we were confronted by locals from the outset. Says, Mr. Bostic, Carl, what happens if I get killed? Who's going to take care of my family? And we've had to come up with a plan, and Maria can give more specific.
Well, we insure everyone, but what happens in the field is that they don't call me before they hire someone. You may be surprised. So you need to have an umbrella insurance that actually covers everyone, and it's an umbrella that doesn't necessarily have the names, whether local or or British hire, like myself. So we have umbrellas that cover everything, and there are brokers in the city that will cover you everywhere you go if you pay the right amount of money.
Just one more quick thing. I think at the end of the day, I think part of the problem is also that you're dealing with very big companies, organizations, and maybe much smaller operations. So you have a sliding scale of care and concern. But that doesn't absolve anyone from their care of duty. It should be the same across the board. And that's what has to happen with the smaller groups, for example. And then you know what? There are things that happen that we don't, quote, have to do. I'll give a perfect example. One of our long and trusted employees who had fought in the Iran-Iraq war, he had lost his leg. He had a horrible like wooden leg or whatever, and because of our contacts in the green zone, we finally arranged for him to get an up-to-date modernized prosthetic, and it's changed his quality of life considerably, for example. Another case of a driver who unfortunately died prematurely. He was off our rolls, and because of his duty of service, and part of the problem is there's a difference between people who work for you for an extended period of time, to quote the big story, when you only meet someone, let's say, for a week or so. There still has to be a regime for that. So forget all the rules and such. There's always the compassion that's out there that we try to abide by.
We're going to start winding this down now, and the conversation can continue in the bar. Najibullah, you wanted to say something.
I want to just say it very briefly. We talked about journalists being killed or kidnapped by the bad guys, and also by the rebels going to oppositions. I talked about the journalists who were killed by the American military, and now they're in prison. There's one journalist who is in prison in Kabul. I forgot his name, Tribe might remember. And there are some Al Jazeera journalists who are in Guantanamo. We never raised these issues. We should make those headlines. As I work for Al Jazeera International last year for a month in Afghanistan with James Bays. I was when we were approaching Americans, we were treated like terrorists. We were treated like dodgy people. I mean, all of us had beard. I mean, I don't blame them for this, but after checking our passport in passing, still we were queued separately, and they were going through every single details and asking stupid questions. We should address the journalists that they are now in American custody, either in Afghanistan, Iraq, or Guantanamo, and also were killed as well. This is we shouldn't be just blaming one side. I mean, terrorists or the bad guys or the bad guys, they say we don't care. But these people, they are talking about freedom of speech, protection for media, but still they are arresting people. The incident in Jalalabad about 3 months ago, 3 months ago, 2 AP journalists were when they took some pictures of Americans shooting civilians. They smashed their cameras, the stills and the tapes were taken, and nobody protested against those. They were about the Americans said they killed 16 civilians, but there were more than 50 people who were killed that day.
This is what the CPJ does, Najibullah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, I mean, it's not true that nobody does anything. The Committee to Protect Journalists and other organizations do a lot of lobbying of the Pentagon and the Congress on this very point. And next month, we are holding an event with the National Press Club in Washington to address the 2 journalists who are currently in U.S. detention. One is the Sami al-Hajj, who works for Al Jazeera, who is in Guantanamo Bay, and the other one is a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer for the Associated Press called Bilal Hussein, who is in detention in Iraq. Those are the 2 that we know about and are taking up. So there are people out there, and we would like your help or your information when you do learn of these arrests, and we will take up the cases of people who are detained by the United States forces.
Well, you should talk afterwards, I guess, about the Kabul case. Rodney Pinder, what do you want to add to this? And also, I thought perhaps we could think about whether there's something that a consensus at this meeting would support. And I'd ask Rodney Pinder of INSEE to give some thought to the kind of sense of the meeting that we could, in a way, support as a declaration. So, Rodney, you want to enumerate some of the things that you think all news organizations should be comfortable in supporting?
Yep. First of all, I just wanted to very briefly, I used the word apartheid earlier quite advisedly, because I think internationally we are in danger of developing in safety terms a system where we have the privileged, the international correspondents, the ones who work for big organizations, having all the safety wherewithal that they should have, but so many hundreds of locals who are not given the same protection at all. And if that divide is real and it's visible and it's there all the time. I come back to what Bob Marley said. We realize that many news organizations around the world do not have the wherewithal. Duty of care is a burden, and it's a heavy and expensive burden. It's a strain on budgetary resources. Chris Kramer at CNN used to tear his hair out at the amount of money proper duty of care costs CNN. But there are rich companies who can afford to give the same treatment to their local staff as they do international, as Bob said. Half of those journalists killed were working for Western or Japanese organizations. And don't tell me these organizations cannot provide the same safety protection to their local staff as they do to their international staff. And I'd certainly like to see something coming out of this meeting, and a sense of the meeting. Perhaps a declaration, or perhaps just a show of hands, just for the obvious principle, which it seems to me to need restating, that all journalists, when it comes to safety and danger, should be treated equally,
and on the same basis, whether international or local, whether contract or staff, whether freelance, or however you're engaged in the news gathering operation, you should be given the same safety training, advice and equipment as the international staff assigned to the story.
Well, we can leave it at that. Although, you drew up some other points. Rodney's declaration would include these. Again, everyone given equal access to safety training and retraining. Employers are encouraged to make this mandatory. Employers must provide sufficient safety equipment to all local staff and freelancers assigned to hazardous situations, including flak jackets, protective headgear, and properly protected vehicles. In the event of a kidnapping or hostage situation, local and international staff must be given equal weight in any considerations, negotiations, and other actions aimed at securing their release. That was the starting point for tonight's discussion. And that all local staff and freelancers should be afforded personal insurance while working in hostile areas, including cover against death and personal injury. And employers should provide and encourage the use of voluntary and confidential counseling for local staff and freelancers after the coverage of distressing events.
Can you still wait for the mic?
I'm absolutely supportive in principle of all of those things. But I would like to say, too, that I do believe, and I'm only speaking on behalf of the people that we help, which is the freelance community, we also believe that the freelance community should also take responsibility for themselves. We would never say it is just a one-sided thing. So I totally endorse these points, but with the understanding that freelance, whoever, basically people do have to have also a certain amount of self-responsibility. Does that make sense to you, or does that sound a bit...
You could ask for a show of hands in support of these general principles. All supporting? Take that as an overwhelming show of support. Any final thoughts? We're going to wrap this up. And also, if there's anyone in this room who's been sitting there quietly and feels we have missed something, or there was really a point you wanted to make and you didn't get an opportunity, now's the time. This is like a Quaker meeting where you sit quietly, think about what you have to say, and then... Anyone? Well, if not, then I'd like to very much thank Najibullah, I'd like to thank John, I'd like to thank Kim and Rob, and thank all of you.